either at the airport or in Boston. They left for the Heart Rhythm Society meeting. But those that are here are up for a treat. And I have to be punctual on time because Professor Glikson is leaving direct straight from here at 6:25 to the airport. So he's also going to Boston. So anyway, we're very happy to host Dr. Glikson. A little bit about his history. First of all, he was born and raised in Jerusalem, which is really a beautiful, beautiful city and very intriguing and interesting. I encourage all of you to go visit. He then did his MD, studied medicine at Hadassah, or the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And then his residency was at the Sheba Medical Center, which is in Tel Aviv. From there, he went to the Mayo Clinic, where he became specialized in cardiac electrophysiology. I think with Steve Hamill and David Hayes, these people, those who know them. And then went back to Israel and became a cardiologist and an EP at the Sheba Medical Center in Tel Aviv, where he did his residency. More recently, he moved to Jerusalem, back to Jerusalem. He didn't move to live there, but he moved to work there at the Shaare Zedek Medical Center, which is very fast growing and becoming a very prominent hospital in Israel. There are two big ones in Jerusalem. This is one of them. And he's having administrative responsibility, heading the heart center there. And he's also been very involved in the European societies as well as societies here, but mostly I think in the European society and European journals like Europace. The Dead Sea Symposium is one of the activities that he organizes and so on. So we're very happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Yoram. Thank you all for staying. It gives me a special pleasure to be here. I knew of this place. I heard a lot about this institution and all the great things that you're doing here. I was fortunate to have this opportunity to visit here this time, and I hope to come back in the future to see it more in depth. The topic of this talk is about lessons from the National Israeli ICD Registry. I don't have any conflict of interest that is related to the topic. This is an aerial view of Jerusalem. As Yoram told you, this is the most fascinating city in the world. I believe we discussed it over lunch today. In this picture, you can see here the holiest places for Jews, the second holiest places for Muslims, a few holy places for Christians. The Church of Holy Sepulchre is somewhere here. So no matter who your God is, if you want to be close to him, this is the place to be. I'm presenting this data, this talk on behalf of the Israeli Working Group of Basic Electrophysiology, which owns the data and also runs the National ICD Registry, and this association that runs the administration of the registry. Just a few facts about Israel to put things in perspective. The population of Israel is 8.5 million. 75% of them are Jewish, and there are 20% Arabs. And I'll show you some data relevant to this. The area of Israel is small. It's one seventh of New York State. You have 450 times in the area of the United States. It's a Western economy. It's a member of the OECD. We have high life expectancies, 82 overall, 80 for male, 84 for female. I think that we are ranked second in the world in females and fourth in the world in in males, so really high life expectancies and high quality medicine. Why did we have this registry? Why have registries at all? First of all, the real life data are not exactly as they appear in studies. The case mix is different, the age is different, sex, underlying diseases, low volume centers that are not represented in the big studies. The real life is also different from what is done in the guidelines. It's interesting to learn how we're doing with the guidelines. There are geographical and ethnical differences in population and practices when compared to the classical studies. Follow-up results, and I'll show you some examples, may serve to reassess indications and recertification. We can capture early device or lead malfunction when it's related to devices, and sometimes you have specific batches that are sent to your country. We had a history of discovering a big recall in one of the companies that was first presented in batches that were sent to Israel. So you don't necessarily have to wait to data from the big companies to pick up device problems. Registry over years follows dynamic trends in device treatment, the type of devices that you use, special testing, and I'll show you some examples of all of these. The results serve to improve the practice of the participating centers, may change the policy of healthcare providers. One of the best examples, this registry was at the beginning, it started in 2010 when primary prevention ICDs were not accepted by all the HMOs for the many 2 indications. One of the HMOs was still debating this indication, and we were able, after 1 or 2 years of the registry, to present data to the different HMOs and show one HMO that they are doing much worse than the others, and then they change the policy. And it's a basis for clinical studies and hypothesis generation. The Israeli ICD Registry was launched in July 2010, and the data were locked in June 2017. It's a voluntary registry that was organized by the Israeli Working Group for Pacing and Electrophysiology with some technical assistance by device companies. There was online reporting at the end of each high-powered device procedure on site. Data were secured, were delivered to a web-based secure database. No data were collected on complications intentionally because it was a voluntary registry. We decided not to collect complications, which is kind of the weakness of this, and this element is not covered. Commercial information was kept confidential because all the companies helped with this registry. Medical centers were de-identified in the report. It was supported by Israeli Working Group for Pacing and Electrophysiology, device companies, Israeli Center for Disease Control, and the major HMO. There was a yearly follow-up that was started 1 year after the beginning of the registry. The follow-up was done by the registry headquarters that issued a quarterly request of follow-up data to the centers. 17 out of 24 centers participated in the follow-up phase, and we started this 1 year after the implementation. Sources of follow-up data vary between centers. They included real-time data entry during ICD clinics in some, chart review in others, and phone interviews with patients in the remaining centers. We give you some statistics of the whole registry. We recruited 9,256 patients, new implants in 24 hospitals. The median age was 64.7, 83% of them were male. 4.5% were upgrades from pacemakers to high-power devices. 77% were implanted for primary prevention, and there was a trend that started. We started with 72% back in 2010, and it increased to 80% recently. So there was an ongoing increase in the rate of primary prevention ICDs. Part of it was due to the issue that I mentioned to you before, that some of the HMOs needed some, we had to persuade some of the HMOs based on the data of the first 2 years to approve primary prevention ICDs for everybody. The total number of patients who had follow-up was close to 6,000 from 17 hospitals. Not all of them participated. And the median follow-up time was 25 months. This is a distribution of implantation by medical centers. If you divide it to, this is for the 7-year period. So if you divide it to 7 years, you see that most of the centers were modest-sized centers that implanted between 50 to 100 cases a year. Some of the bigger centers were between 100 and 200 cases a year. So we're not dealing with any huge centers, and the majority were modest size. Looking at the device types over the years, this was the situation in 2011, where CRTD made up 38% of the cases, dual chamber were 29%, single chamber 15%. This is a kind of an Israeli invention, CRTD with plug. The reason to implant CRTD without the plug was in cases that we suspected may need CRT in the future, but were not indicated at the point of the implantation, just to be able to add a lead without changing the pulse generator because of the issue of the cost. This didn't prove to work because we at some point we reviewed all our cases and realized that hardly any of them were actually upgraded. They reached replacement without being upgraded. So this practice has been partially abandoned. And this is the situation as of the last year of the registry. The numbers of CRTDs decreased because of the most strict criteria of QRS width, and some people became more realistic about their expectations from CRTD. The number of single chamber devices increased, so we tended to use more and more shock boxes. As I said, CRTDs with plug decreased. This is the distribution by New York Heart Association class. As you see, there's about 1/3 of the cases for each class between 1 and 3. In both, it wasn't really a very important difference between the periods of time. According to guidance, we had between 1 and 2% of the cases that were in EHA class 4. If we look at the distribution of ejection fractions, these were more or less the same over the years, but a little more than 50%, a little more than half were with low ejection fraction below 30, another third between 30 and 40. Some of them were normals. These were mainly hypertrophs and primary electrical diseases, and a few more with mildly reduced function. If we look at the etiology, the incidence of coronary artery disease is higher. The incidence of non-coronary disease is lower in Israel. We have a relatively small number of non-ischemic dilated cardiomyopathy. We had about 1/5 of the patients had non-ischemic dilated cardiomyopathy. Almost 3/4 had coronary artery disease. There's about 5% of hypertrophs, some congenital, and 2.5% primary electrical diseases. Of them, the majority was idiopathic VF, some lung QTs, and a few vulgars. So this is the distribution. The typical distribution in other countries have a higher percent of non-ischemic dilated cardiomyopathy. We have in Israel a small amount of this disease. The overall incidence of atrial fibrillation in our population was 20%. About half of them were paroxysmal, 30% were permanent, and in 2% we don't know. 15% were persistent but not permanent. If we look at non-initial procedures that were also included in this registry, we had 3,500 cases. The mean age, of course, is higher because these are secondary procedures. Mean age of 67, majority were male. Two-thirds were type changes. Median replaced device lifetime was 67 months, a little more than 5.5 years. The majority were replaced for end of life or elective replacement. I'll jump to here and tell you that about 60% of the change pulse generator never delivered any therapy, and we'll go back to this later. There were 12% that were replaced due to lead-related procedures, and 24% had combined lead and pulse generator replacement. With quite a few studies published out of this registry that I'm going to discuss with you, they were published between the 2012 and until recently, and I'm going to go through the results of some of them with you. Why don't we start with this one that I think is the most interesting study that we did out of the registry. This came at a time where we began to realize, or various studies showed that the actual rate of appropriate therapies for ICDs is actually lower than in the classical studies. And we looked at our own data, as you can see here. Avi Sabag was now an EP fellow at the Mayo Clinic, did this work. And we realized that we had, in our registry population, the rate of shocks, appropriate shocks, in the population of primary prevention was 1.1% per year. This is the lowest rate that we ever appeared in the literature, 1.1% per year of shocks. If we look at patients with secondary prevention, this was 3.8%, still relatively low. If we look at shocks as surrogates of true salvage by the device, we can estimate that 95% of the patients will never be salvaged by the ICD by a lifetime of the device. So this is really a very, very low rate. A rate cutoff of less than 200 was associated with more shocks. Sorry, let's go back to this one. This is the rate of inappropriate shocks. This was also relatively low, because we programmed already according to the new principles of long detection time, high cutoff rate. So there weren't too many inappropriate shocks. But the more shocking fact for us was the very low rate of appropriate shocks.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
For me, that I'm not familiar with the data. So can you tell us, so what is the normal rate, or
Yeah, I'll show you.
compared to?
I'll show you.
Oh, okay.
I'll
Thanks.
show you the data from our studies. Yes. And this is if we look at any therapy, including shocks and anti-tachy pacing, we're looking at something like less than 5%. Per year, it's about 3% per year for primary prevention cases, and about 10% for secondary prevention. But this includes all kinds of anti-tachy pacing. That some of them are probably not really life-saving. And if you go to your question, here is a comparison of our registry with the classical studies of ICDs over the years. This is the MADE-2 at an annual rate of appropriate shock of 17%. SCADEF 5%, Repair 5.4. MADE-3 already, Repair and MADE-3 already use new programming principles with long detection time and high cutoff rates. And these were also in the range of 3 to 6%, whereas our registry had only 1%. Whereas the mortality was more or less the same. So it's interesting. We have a much lower rate than previous studies. And it's probably part of a tendency that exists in other studies as well. So why did we have such low shock rates? Well, we did use new programming principles such as long detection time, high rate get cutoff. People were on optimal medical therapy, full optimal medical therapy in the majority, and we had about 40% of the cases that had CRTD that has an effect by itself. But no doubt that despite all these explanations, there is a strong need to reassess the selection criteria for primary prevention ICDs if we have such low numbers. And actually the recent Danish trial already showed it in dilated cardiomyopathy, and there is a study starting in Europe that is going to reassess the criteria even in ischemic patients. So if you ask me, within several years from now, our criteria will be much more strict for the implantation of high-power device, given all the good medical therapy that we give the patients. This is another study that looked at sex difference in our population. I'm not going to, this is a very busy slide, but I'll walk you through it. We compared the patients who had male patients to female patients. As you can see, the number we had less than 20%, with about 20% women in the study. Ages were the same, but women tend to have much higher rate of dilated cardiomyopathy as opposed to men who had mainly coronary artery disease. They were sicker. There was severe pelvic dysfunction was more abundant. Severe heart failure was more abundant. They had a higher QRS width, and more women were implanted with CRTD than men. You know that in the classical literature, women tend to have lesser effect of ICD, whereas they have higher effect of CRTD. And we don't have follow-up data on this particular work, but we can see that women are implanted when they are sicker, and more of them fit to CRTD implantation. I'm sorry, we do have this follow-up to show you. The follow-up was exactly the same. The course was the same. If we look at appropriate ICD, if we look at heart failure admission or death, the follow-up was probably similar between men and women. We had this work on ethnic differences. As I told you, about 20% of our population are Arab patients, and we look at the ICD recipients among the Jewish population, the Arab population. We reviewed at that time 4,500 patients. 16% of them were Arabs. Arabs were characterized by younger age on presentation, more common dilated idiopathic cardiomyopathy, 40% of them, as opposed to 26% in the Jewish population, and familial cardiac death was more common. These two facts probably represent the fact that in the Arab population there is consanguinity and familial diseases, but the profile of patients implanted who were Arabs was significantly different. We don't have any long-term follow-up of these two populations. You know that the issue of renal dysfunction is a big issue in indications for ICD. Some of the previous studies demonstrated lack of benefit from ICDs in patients with severe chronic kidney disease or dialysis patients. It was a sub-analysis of the MEDI2 trial that showed no benefit of ICD in chronic renal failure, severe chronic renal failure, and a few other publications as well. We looked at our population. The red curve represented survival curve of patients with normal renal function among our ICD implanted patients. The blue one is a moderate renal dysfunction, and this is the curve of survival of severe renal dysfunction with GFR less than 30. Well, there's no surprise because, of course, these patients tend to die more. And this is the group of patients with ICD. But look at the patients with CRTD. CRTD seemed to have corrected the difference between the severe renal dysfunction to normal or moderate. Among CRTD patients, there was no difference between the groups. So there was something in the CRTD that corrected the increased mortality of patients with severe chronic renal failure. And we observed the same phenomenon in some other groups that I'm going to show you. By the way, GFR decreased in the ICD group, but not in the CRTD group. This is another observation made on renal dysfunction. We looked at all levels of renal dysfunction. This is the survival curve of patients with normal, mildly, moderately reduced is in green, and severely reduced renal function and dialysis. What's interesting is that, as opposed to previous works that determined that dialysis patients do worse, in our group at least, the patients with severely reduced renal dysfunction did the same as dialysis patients. So dialysis was not an additional risk factor. All patients with severe chronic kidney disease, whether they were on dialysis or not, had a higher mortality, but they did not differ between each other. The rate of shocks, though, was somewhat higher in the more severe patients and highest in the dialysis patients, although this difference did not reach statistical significance. So we had some observations on renal patients that is different from the classical teaching. This is another work that we did on elderly patients. This is the survival curve of patients with defibrillator, ICDs, age less than 65 on implantation, 66 to 75, and age about 75, which is not surprising. Patients who are older die more frequently. And you know that there is again, the previous studies are kind of controversial, but there is a benefit to ICD in the elderly, but of course the absolute gain in life is smaller. Again, if you look at the patients who received CRTD, these differences are non-existent. So again, the CRTD kind of corrected the adverse prognosis that is related to age, and actually made the survival curve of all these ages more or less similar. It made numbers are significant. I mean, these were not very small groups, but again, the CRTD was able to correct the increased mortality that happens in elderly patients who are on ICDs, and makes them similar to the younger age groups. If we look at complication rates, they were similar in all age groups. So this is again encouraging result that the elderly do not have significantly higher complication rates. So there's no reason not to go ahead and implant them with ICD, or better CRTD for those who are indicated for CRTD, because it increases their survival. This is a work that we did on patients with advanced heart failure. We hardly had any NIHA class 4, but we did have quite a few patients with NIHA class 3. And this is a survival curve of patients on ICDs. This is actually the total study population. NIHA class 1 and 2, survival over time, up to 600 days. And this is the survival of patients who are most of them are in NIHA class 3. Of course, not surprising. There are people who are at higher NIHA class tend to die more. But if we divide the data into ICDs versus CRTD, we see the same phenomenon again. Patients with ICDs maintain the advantage of NIHA class 1 and 2 over 3. But once you have a CRTD in, the mortality curves become the same. So again, the CRTD kind of improved the situation of the lowest of the worst group and made it similar to the better NIA class groups. We looked at the population of diabetic patients. We looked at the initial diagnosis. The initial analysis was done on a little more than 2,000 patients, of whom 746 were diabetic. The others were not diabetic. Diabetic patients were older. They were more likely to have ischemic cardiomyopathy, lower ejection fraction, more atrial fibrillation, and many other comorbidities. But whereas the overall mortality of diabetic patients was higher than patients who were not diabetic, this was not due to arrhythmia, because the rate of appropriate shocks was exactly the same, and the exact of inappropriate shock was more or less the same. This is in contradiction to previous studies that demonstrated higher arrhythmia rate in diabetes. In our group, although the mortality was higher, it was not associated with any increased risk of arrhythmia. VF testing, or what we used to call DFT, was a hot debate until several years ago. It was kind of buried by the Simple and the Nordic trial. I think it was the Nordic trial that proved that there is no advantage in VF testing. Although these studies involved only left-sided simple implants, they did not look at replacements or right-sided implants. But for classical implantation, they kind of put an end to VF testing. But the simple trial was published in 2015, and the Nordic a little bit later. And as you can see, starting from 2010, we already had a marked decrease in VF testing. Coming down to 2015, we already were below 3%. So people tend to shy away from VF testing over the years. By the way, for replacement, we had much less than 3% testing, and I think it was wrong, because none of these studies looked at replacements, and we know from Canadian registry that the rate of problems that are discovered by DFT testing during replacements is actually much higher than during primary implantation. And we are currently conducting a study called Simple for replacement, looking specifically at ICD replacements, doing VF testing during ICD replacements, and looking at the rate of uncovered problems. We expect it to be much higher than primary implantation. Anyway, if we looked at the long-term follow-up of patients by yes or no VF testing or DFT testing, and we confirmed the results of the Simple and the Nordic trial that it had no effect, no long-term effect whatsoever. The issue of single versus dual chamber ICD is also an old debate in the field of ICDs. There are several arguments to each one of them. Those who support dual chamber ICD think about the need for future atrial pacing that may come up, better discrimination of arrhythmias, less inappropriate therapies, there's an ongoing debate, better documentation of arrhythmia, that's for sure, and also better detection of silent atrial fibrillation. All these are confirmed by dual chamber ICDs. Single chamber ICD are simpler, cheaper, and in most studies there was no advantage of dual chamber ICDs in prevention of inappropriate shocks. We had some contribution to the field in two studies that I conducted with my colleagues at Mayo Clinic. By the way, this study was one of the few studies that actually proved advantage for dual chamber ICDs over single chamber ICDs for detection of arrhythmia, for appropriate detection of arrhythmia. This was neutral. In any case, we looked at our data of the registry to try to contribute to this debate. And just to give you the bottom line of these 5 graphs, there was no difference whatsoever in appropriate shocks, inappropriate shocks, survival, or anything between dual chamber and single chamber. So at least in our data, they seem to be equal, and there was no advantage in dual chamber over single chamber. The issue of single versus dual coil is also an evolving issue over the years. Until not so many years ago, we used to implant mostly dual coil ICDs because we believed that the DFT was better with dual coil ICDs, whereas as we became more acquainted with extraction, we realized that dual coil is much more difficult to extract, and people tended to move to single coil devices, single coil leads and single coil devices. And what you see here is a tendency over time, based on our registry of implantation. This is the curve of ICD dual coil that fell significantly, or the use of dual coil ICD fell significantly, the same in CRT cases, and the use of single coil ICDs increased significantly over time. And despite lack of DFT testing, I mean, the fact that people started to do single coil devices did not result in more VF testing. They just switched to single coil ICDs over time, and I realized that there are several other studies from other places in the world that show the same tendency. The long-term follow-up was more or less the same. There was no difference in the significant, over a significant period of time, there was no difference between dual coil and single coil. So we are on our way to switch almost all cases to single coil ICDs, which are easier to remove. So let me conclude the results of this and our conclusions from it. That using the registry information, we were able to show very low rate of delivered ICD therapies over time. The CRT usefulness in chronic kidney disease patients. No difference between dialysis patients and non-dialysis patients with severe chronic kidney disease. The advantage of CRTD in the elderly. The advantage of CRTD in advanced heart failure. The lack of effect of TF testing, as well as the use of dual chamber or dual coil ICDs. The National Registry provides real-life information on ICD and CRTD practice. It demonstrates changing trends of use of ICD and CRTD over the years. It enables in-depth analysis of specific patient groups that are underrepresented in landmark studies, and may enable better selection of patients for ICD CRT therapy in the future. I mean, we'll probably take these data of very low shock rate to try to analyze who are the patients who are not benefiting from ICDs. We are certainly overdoing if there's such a low rate of shocks. And let me finish by inviting you to this meeting toward the end of October in Israel. It will be in Tel Aviv. Yoram is going to be one of the speakers in the plenary session. It's an enjoyable meeting, bringing together many top experts from both Europe and America, and you are all invited. Thank you very much.
In your data there where you showed those that received appropriate shocks, like in 1 year, how many patients do you have at that point? If you want to go back and do something like logistic regression, the rates are so low, how many patients are actually at a year that had an appropriate shock, or at 2 years, whatever time point you want to take?
I think the whole group was about 2,000.
That's the total? So you have like 3% of 2,000, right? So maybe you got 60 patients. But that actually had shocks?
there. So we started here with about 2,000 patients. But if you look only at the primary prevention, that's a group of 1,600. And only 1% of them got shock. So if you're
It's going to be really hard to identify what the predictors are with that few. You're going to need a really massive number to be able to try to identify who you shouldn't be giving pacemakers or defibrillators to based on this data since it's so few shocks. But it seems like the criteria are quite,
the criteria are the guidelines.
yeah, the guidelines are. So if you, what is the reasonable expectation, number of years you would expect the average person who gets an ICD to live?
It's between 7 and 8. That's the usual.
Okay, so even if it was 10 years at, 1% per year, but, you're only talking about 10% of your patients, most who would ever.
90% will die without having any therapy. So we're overdoing.
Yeah. So you're going to need some multinational registry to kind of identify what to redo the criteria because of this just incredible, small rate of
Well,
use.
the Danish has done it for dilated cardiomyopathy patients, and they actually showed no benefit for patients with dilated cardiomyopathy with prevention ICDs, although a fair number of them were CRTD, and this may be one of the reasons why the mortality was so low. And there is actually a study starting in Europe trying to look at it in coronary patients. So I'd not be surprised if in several years we implant many less ICDs.
Just based on your personal experience and your intuition, what do you think are some of the things that are affecting this low rate of usage?
There are some multifactorial indices that try to calculate the chance of a patient to receive a shock, or on the other hand, which implantations are futile. One of them is a Goldenberg index. Ilan Goldenberg is someone who used to work in our center until recently and has now replaced Arthur Moss in Rochester, New York, as the head of the research institute there. He built an index of 5 factors, which include atrial fibrillation, renal failure, heart failure, curious width, and one more, I don't remember what it was. Those who were at the highest end and those who were at the lowest end had no benefit from ICD. So maybe the answer would be some kind of a score that you have to calculate. But this was retrospective work. Obviously, you can't rely on this.
Right.
It has to
But
be
it's an
some kind of-
indication.
If you don't have anything, like normal MRI, TO of alternates, whatever you want, everything is normal except the ejection fraction, you probably don't have to implant this, just based on the ejection fraction.
Great talk. It's a provocative registry. My first thought is these are healthy, or at least they're educated people that are motivated. The life expectancy is so high. These indications aren't very good for this population. So I was wondering, is your healthcare system, I'm not sure how things are paid for in Israel. And it seems to me they would look at this data and say, we are wasting our money on ICDs. We need to cut this out. Will that happen, do you think?
It's difficult to act against guidance. Even for the toughest HMO, it's difficult to act against the guidance. But as you know, for example, ischemic cardiomyopathy with ejection fraction below 30, New York Heart Association 1, has been removed from the European guidelines. So there is a process, gradual process, to decrease the number of implantations.
My other question is unrelated. Was there a difference in mortality between single and dual chamber defibrillator? Just thinking about, there wasn't. So David trial observation, apparently we're smarter and the devices are more sophisticated.
We don't paste them. I mean, although they have dual chamber, we don't paste them.
So just to add to that, I mean, if you implant too many ICDs, it's not just that you're wasting money. You're causing people a lot of damage. Psychological damage, they have to live with an ICD. It only benefits 1%. What's the point for all these people to walk around with ICDs, feel terrible about what they have inside their ear, and false positive, false negative. This is all a heavy price for this population, in addition to the cost. So I wonder, we really need some better criteria. And one thing that I've been noticing is that in all of these criteria, and it always surprises me that there are no electrical criteria in all this. It's all a rejection fraction and those kind of things, but not kidney.
Right now, it's
But no electrical.
fraction and New York Heart Association test.
Yeah.
That's it. That's probably not enough.
We need some electrophysiological criteria for these people, these patients.
Well, theory of alternance used to be pseudo electrophysiology. MRI may help.
Well, the legacy, EP studies, and that has to be the thing, and then it became clear that even counting PECs was just as good as EP study, and the whole thing sort of fell apart. So then we just have focused on the ejection fraction, since that seemed to be a more predictive indicator. Certainly QRS duration is a predictor of outcome.
No, one word of caution, this is a voluntary registry. Maybe the 1%. It's not 10%.
Selection bias.
It's not a randomized controlled trial where every patient is being chased, but still, the rate is very low. We may have missed a few.
So I am not an expert at all, so I just have some naive questions. Have you looked at, so you said that you need to reassess, what kind of patient to have implant. But then, did you look at the population of your ICD implant versus the total patient that are considered, and compared to other situations that you have this extremely low incidence, but do you have actually more implementations than other studies, for example? So other studies have higher incidence, but is that because in other population they have less people or more selected people that are having
We use the
incidence?
same, I mean, the criteria of the previous studies were translated into guidelines. We use the guidelines. However, the main two was, I believe, something like 2002. So we're 10 to 15 years ahead. Medical therapy is better. We don't rely on shocks as endpoints. I think it's the time and the changing pattern of the disease rather than the difference.
So-
In fact, the most recent study of that, I think it was 2012, in that table you showed, was much closer to your numbers.
Right, because they already use new
Right.
programming,
Right.
which removes all the false data from shocks that were premature shocks,
So
not
your data is
inappropriate
not
but
really out of line
unnecessary shocks.
with what other people reported this time.
Okay, so
You
then
know, in the remote past, we used to rely on shocks as surrogates for salvage, but that's not true.
yeah, so I mean, there besides ICD, there are also other therapies, right? So like the drug and also catheter and all those things. So if the patients do not put on ICD, what are alternatives for these patients? And
Current guideline-based medical therapy. Remember that we're talking about primary prevention patients, not those who had cardiac arrest. I mean, these should still ICD. But for primary prevention, we are probably overdoing it. Guideline-based medical therapy may suffice for a large part of it. The important part is how can you tell who is going to.
So the
And
guideline.
nobody is going to fund such a study because the device companies did such a great job proving to us that everybody needs ICD. They're not going to fund studies to limit the population.
Isn't bad news to them.
Yeah, so, sorry, I mean, you talk about the guideline medical, so this is too much of the term for me. So does that mean this is the drug therapy, or?
Yes. I mean,
Okay, so-
the current
Yeah.
drug therapy.
But the drug therapy also has its problems, right? So most of the drugs are also tolerant, right?
I'm not talking about anti-diabetic drugs. I'm
Okay.
talking about the other drugs.
Others, okay.
ACE, beta blockers, aldosterone antagonists.
So may I miss this? Did you compare ischemic versus non-ischemic at all?
We did not in this one.
And you had was it like, I guess, in your distribution, there were a lot of ischemics, right? Or is
There
it
were
per
more
more?
than 70%. Most of them were ischemic.
Because the randomized trials, both STUD-F and NADIT, showed mortality, just shocks.
Right.
Especially in Zedek, there was a big, 5% absolute mortality. You can say they got inappropriately shocked, but still there was a mortality.
Right. But they were not on the current medical.
And that was much smaller in study, but that was only, I think, 5% mortality benefit over 8 years, so less than 1% benefit per year.
Okay, well, thank you so much again.